Hey everyone, George here. Sorry about this episode. Unfortunately, I upgraded to the latest version of my capture software, which means nothing absolutely works. So I'm just going to narrate this as best I can. It was an hour-long video, but I've distilled it down into 10 minutes because I don't think you want to deal with me trying to get this to work. Anyway, looking at a reference material, I'm going to start working on the door in this particular example. Here we go. I hide everything. I'm just looking at the door itself. I'm going to go ahead and select that and remove all the other objects. In this particular case, I'm going to get rid of the geometry in the center. I'm going to go ahead and add some cuts, move it up to the top, mirror the geometry over to the bottom, and then what I will do is create another cut at the top and the bottom using insert edge loops, and then I will scale them down towards the centers and then just roughly eyeball it to where it should actually be. Next up, I'm going to need to deal with the UVs for this particular object. Nothing terribly difficult, but before I do that, why don't we go ahead and add a bevel? So I go ahead and try to add a bevel to all the different areas. I screw that up, I undo it, I bring it down, do it again, and pretty much it's just two particular segments in the bevel to make it look somewhat interesting. Since it's a metal object, I make sure the bevel's offset is really low. Because it shouldn't be a soft object. Then again, we go ahead into the UV portion of this, and in this case, it is a pretty much flat object, so there's no reason for me to do anything special. All I'm going to do is a planar one. I'm going to cut it up so that the back portion of it's separate from the front portions, and I'm actually going to go ahead and cut each of the different segments up into different areas. The reason I do this is because it allows me to maximize my UV space better than if I allowed them to be one large object. In addition, it's just a better way to segment things out. When I'm inside of Substance Painter, I know exactly which parts are supposed to be lines and which parts are supposed to be just metal objects. Here you can see me, I've got some distortion going on when I do an unfold, and I'm cutting up those little tiny bits on the end so that they become flatter and everything becomes very, two-dimensional and flat. Now that that's done, I'm going to go ahead and lay things out. I want to check my settings, make sure they all make sense, and we can see what happens right there. If I remember correctly, I screwed this up a couple times. I'm going to undo it, try it again, go ahead and move those objects over. Unfold them and once again lay them out. Now I'm not happy with some of the layouts here. I'm going to rotate them 90 degrees so that these objects are relatively in the same direction as the rest of them. Then I'm going to do another layout, but this time I'm not going to allow it to rotate. I make sure that all the different objects have the same facing side. That is, none of them are red versus blue. And once again, I try to look and see whether or not they're all in the same direction. Then I'm going to take all these different objects and export them out, bring them into Substance Painter, and this begins a time of painting, which I will screw up time and time again, as you'll see in just a few moments. I bring it in, we're going to bake stuff. I have an idea of what I want to do. I want to use this particular caution texture. Unfortunately, this texture is actually meant for cement, so it's got this kind of grit to it, so I've got to remove that information from it. I try a little bit to see if I can get rid of it. I notice I can do a few things that are pretty interesting looking. I can kind of make the tape look a little bit worn out, or I should say paint in this example, and I go with that for the most part. Now I go ahead and add the paint layer to it. I use a mask to make sure that only the paint region is where it should be, and I play for a while trying to get this to blend in properly, and I mess it up quite a few times before I'm able to get it right, and that's because I'd actually added the paint portion to it before the mask, or I should say I added it not to the mask but to the actual object itself, which messed everything up. So I'm going to end up going back and forth several times in this video, and you can see here I'm trying, and I'm basically failing at trying to blend the caution tape slightly into the paint as if it was worn away. Now I see that I really like this rust that's going on. However, I also noticed that there is a height difference. So I go through my different layers and I make sure that the height itself is replaced and not added. By doing that, what you're going to notice is that it's not blending the two different layers together. Now, once again, I'm playing around, I screw it all up, I understand that, I get rid of it and restart again. But then I noticed these creases here and there that I'm not particularly proud of. And I noticed that if you look at the boundaries of my UVs, they're right up against the edges. And I believe that has something to do with why I'm having problems with displaying these objects properly. So I go back in, I redo the layout, and this time not only do I have a shell spacing, but I also have a tile spacing, which means that they will be offset from the edges. And this fixes pretty much 90% of my problems. I do have one other problem, and the way that I diagnose it is I start drawing on the surface of the object to see where the problem actually comes from. And I notice it has something to do with the fact that one set of UVs happens to be upside down. Now I go ahead and flip that around, I rebake it, and it gets rid of most of the issue, but it's kind of still there a little bit. At this point, I'm kind of just I'm done with it. I'm going to just move on with what I'm doing, and I pretty much do that. So I bring it back in, I bake the object out, and things are looking okay. I go ahead and just throw in the caution tape once again. I make sure it's in every specific area, and I'm going to try my best, but ultimately I end up getting rid of the height and normal maps on that thing because they're just a giant mess. And I try a couple different alpha layers to see if they're going to benefit me at all, but none of them really do. I'm also going to give several of the generators and several of the different filters a go, but none of them really work out for me. It's probably because I don't know the program well enough at this point, but I end up just kind of giving up on that, and instead I just take a brush and an alpha map that's somewhat coarse and hard, and I'm just going to go along the edges and pretty much just make it look good enough for what I'm doing. Here you can see me trying and attempting to paint this thing, and just nothing's really working. So finally I've given up, and now I'm going along all the different edges. This takes a little bit of time, obviously. You know, it's not as fast as anything else, but ultimately it gives me the results I want, and that's really all that's important. You know, I probably shouldn't have been so hasty to try to find some algorithm that would do everything for me in this particular case. Just going back and forth on each of these different lines. I mean, really, it's only, what, 1, 2, 3, 4 lines at most that I've got to deal with. It would have been easier for me to have just done this from the start. So anyway, there you go. You see me making them work properly. I'm going to go here now, and I'm going to remove all that height and normal information. You can see the paint looks really good. At least I think it does. Play around a little bit with the height on the steel painted portion of it until I get something that I really like. And I'm going to go ahead and look around. I'm going to add rust, and then I'm going to go to the smart mask section and add a smart mask of ground dirt to it so that it only impacts the lower regions of my objects. I'm going to export that out. I'm going to make sure it's in the Unity metal and what's the other format? Basically anyway, I'm going to export this thing out for a Unity map. I'm going to play around a little bit. I want to see if I can get the height map out as well. I kind of screw this up. It's something that I'm going to end up looking back again in the future. I take a little bit of time, look it up online, make sure I understand what I'm doing. I'm pretty sure it needs to be a not an 8-bit grayscale image, but a 16-bit or a 32-bit grayscale image. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I basically messed it up. I look at the documentation. They don't say anything particularly interesting or good, so I try exporting it out anyway, and well, you'll see in a few moments it fails miserably, but I'll bring it in anyway because ultimately it's a separate texture and it's not going to mess with anything that I'm actually working on. So we go ahead and export it. I copy that, bring it over into my project, into the assets, and into the proper directory. And once that's finished, I'm going to go ahead back into Maya, export out the entire thing. Oh, before that, I need to duplicate that door, bring it over to the other side, and delete the other one. Once that's done, I can go ahead and grab everything in my scene, unhide all the different objects. But unfortunately, I find out that I have a pretty messy scene. I've got multiple groups that have nothing to do with, well, the objects that they're supposed to be in. I have a group not only for the office, but I have another group for all the office items. So what you're seeing now is me going through and cleaning up all those particular objects, getting them all into one particular group, so that when I click on that group, I can go to File, Export, and it will replace everything necessary and make it all work properly in one set. Now, if you look carefully, you're going to notice that I'm actually screwing this up slightly. Some other objects are getting exported with it, but it's okay in this particular example. I'll fix that next time. And I go through, I lock down the material in my inspector, and I'm adding those objects to it, and we can see what's going on. I test the height map. I don't like what's going on with it, so I get rid of it. But for the most part, everything else looks just fine. And that's pretty much it for this video. I am very sorry I didn't get to put up the entire video. I'm going to have to figure out why my capture software, well, just absolutely doesn't work. But hopefully I'll figure that out before next time. Thanks everyone for watching, and I will see you in the next video. So long, goodbye.